I want to welcome you all to Align's first webinar series focused on special education funding in Kansas and Missouri. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tori Peterson, and I'm the president and CEO of Aligned. Before we jump into the webinar today, I do want to take a couple of minutes to go over a few housekeeping items to remind you about. Again, we are recording today's webinar to send out to you and other registrants after the event. And I'd love if you could please save all of your questions to the end. We've provided plenty of time at the end of this presentation to answer questions that have come up throughout the conversation. Before we jump into the webinar, just a little background on Aligned to begin. Aligned is a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of business leaders committed to improving education in Kansas and Missouri. Our mission is very simple. It's to amplify the business voice to support student achievement and career readiness for all students in Kansas and Missouri. It's my pleasure today to introduce Eric Severson. Eric currently serves as Aligned's Policy and Research Director in Kansas. Prior to his role with Aligned, Eric served as a senior policy specialist at the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Education Commission of the States, where he provided research, policy comparison, and support for tax and education policy issues across all 50 states. A native Kansan and a proud graduate of the University of Kansas, Eric is excited to be back to his home state and contribute his skills and expertise to advancing education and workforce outcomes in Kansas. And with that, I will turn it over to Eric.
Oh, thank you very much for the introduction, Tori, and thanks everyone for being here. Like Tori said, today we're gathered to talk a little bit about special education funding, specifically looking at Missouri and Kansas. Just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about today, I want to start by equipping you all with some crucial background information that I think is foundational to understand how states make funding decisions as it relates to special education funding. Next, I will provide an overview of how special education funding looks specifically across all 50 states. Then Tori and myself will highlight specifically how Missouri and Kansas provide funds for special education students currently. In closing, we will analyze both states and then look at a possible alternative to fund special education students. So let's begin. So in this section, I want to explain what makes special education functionally different than general education in terms of the services provided, but also the financial realities. Finally, I want to show you what the data says about the underlying costs of special education. So when we're talking about special education funding, we're talking about a set of financial supports designed to meet the needs of students that goes beyond the standard classroom. The foundation of this is an individualized education program, or an IEP, which every eligible student must have. These are customized learning plans tailored to each student's abilities, goals, and services. To implement these plans, districts often need additional staffing beyond what is a general classroom requires. That includes special education teachers, assistants and aides, and paraprofessionals. There are things related to these things called related services, like speech therapy, occupational therapy, and mental health counseling that help students access their education. These can be resource intensive and require outside providers or contracted staff with the local education agency. Lastly, the cost of providing individualized support can be significantly higher. Think of students who require assistive technologies, one-on-one instruction, or specialized transportation. These services are necessary but expensive and can vary widely depending on the student we're talking about. Yeah, unlike most areas of education funding, the federal government plays a much more active role in special ed, second only to Title I funding, which is funding provided to low-income students. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, was designed with the goal of the federal government covering up to 40% of the costs of special education services. However, in reality, that level has never been met. The federal funding is typically hovered around 13 to 15%, leaving the rest to be picked up by states and, most significantly, local school districts. States supplement federal IDEA funding with their own formulas, which we're about to talk about, But when these still fall short, districts use flexible local and state funds, sometimes diverting dollars that were meant for other purposes to special ed. Most states use their school finance formulas to provide additional funding for specific student populations, which includes low-income students, English language learners, and the topic of today's conversation, special education students. In theory, all of these groups receive some kind of adjustment or add-on to base amount of funding per pupil, but when it comes to special education, states often treat these students differently, both in terms of how much funding is allocated and also how it is allocated to these students. Unlike other student groups, funding for special ed may come through reimbursements, student-based weights, or separate categorical funds, depending on the state, just to name a few, and we'll get to those in a little bit. This inconsistency appears across states, but also within states, where the formula used for special education might differ substantially than the method used for other student populations. And that's really the heart of today's conversation, is understanding how Kansas and Missouri approach these structurally and what that means in terms of implications for funding equity, transparency, and effectiveness. And last, I want to give you some historical context about what we know about the costs of special education students. So perhaps the most comprehensive national data we have on special ed comes from the Special Education Expenditure Project, or SEEP, published in 2004. This data looked at the 1999-2000 school year and found that across all 50 states and DC, schools spent about $50 billion in non-inflation adjusted dollars on special education services. That translated to an average of about $8,080 per student receiving special ed. Importantly, SEEP calculated the incremental cost, or the difference between a student receiving special education and a general education student, and that figure was about $5,918. So this gives us kind of a baseline, but the data is over 20 years old now, and a lot substantially has changed then, not to mention inflation. So if we fast forward now to a more recent analysis, our friends and partners Bellwether have actually conducted a 2023 analysis that looks at data from the fiscal year 2020. They analyzed over 5,700 school districts across 24 states, and that covers about 41% of students with disabilities nationally. Their analysis found that total spending on special education in these districts reached about $38.8 billion, with an average cost of $13,127 per student, which is a clear increase from the SEEP estimate I just gave you. Where the money comes from is important, though. Federal and state special education funds only covered part of the cost. Federal funding averaged about $1,578 per student. State funding kicked in about $3,388, but that leaves $8,160, or 62% of the cost, that is covered by local funds. That's a pretty heavy lift for districts. So what does this all tell us? I think first, local districts are now carrying a disproportionate share of special education costs, often much more than they do for general education services. Second, there's wide variation across states in how much is spent and how much support districts receive from state budgets. And finally, in states that provide less dedicated special education funding, local districts are forced to pull from their general education budgets to meet required special education needs. That necessarily creates trade-offs, and it can leave school districts struggling to serve both populations effectively. So moving on in this section, I will provide the various ways states fund special education by detailing existing funding mechanisms. Next, I want you to see what this looks like across all 50 states. So let's dig in. States approach special education funding in different ways, but the most common of these mechanisms is to distribute support you see on the left side of the screen. The most common is weighted student funding. This means that the state adds an extra funding for each student with a disability, usually applying a percentage or a dollar amount to the base amount of funding they give out to every student. Some states use a single base amount or single weight for all students receiving services, while others use multiple weights to reflect the type of disability or the severity of disability, so that students needing minimal support receive less funding than a student needing more intensive services. Another common method is reimbursement, where districts submit special education expenses and receive either partial or full payment from a state. And many states also offer high cost aid for students with especially expensive needs on top of other support they may provide. On the right side of the screen, you can see other less common mechanisms, which include categorical funding. This is a separate pool of funding that exists outside of a general education formula based on student or district characteristics. Census-based models estimate how many students in a district likely need special education services, and the state funds every state district like that accordingly, regardless of the actual number of special education students enrolled. And finally, resource allocation models, which are the least common, they fund staff and other services directly, like covering the cost of a speech therapist or an instructional aide, given the amount of students they're actually providing those services to. So as you can see on this slide, the various mechanisms states actually employ. All data comes from the Education Commission of the state's most recent 50-state comparison on K-12 funding. And to summarize their findings and what you're seeing on your screen, 27 states use hybrid models, including Kansas, Missouri. So a mix of 2 or more funding mechanisms to provide support for special education students. Of the remainder of states that only use one funding mechanism for special education students, 10 use multiple student weights, 4 use a single weight, 3 use reimbursement-based funding, and 2 states provide high-cost services funding, while the remaining 2 states use resource-based allocation. So what you just saw is that most states don't rely just on one mechanism. They combine 2 or more to balance the flexibility and predictability of budgeting, but also to implement cost controls at the state and local level. For example, a state may use weights for most students receiving special education services and also offer a high cost reimbursement for a smaller group with very intense needs. Understanding these national patterns, I think, helps set the next part of our conversation up well, where we're going to look closely at Kansas and Missouri and how they structure their approaches. So with that, I want to turn it over to Tori, who I think will help us understand how Missouri funds special education.
Thanks, Eric. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the fast facts about the Missouri special education funding system, and then I'm going to share 2 of the mechanisms currently being used to fund it. So let's dig in. Missouri spends roughly $542 million out of the state coffers for special education services. As you can see, we serve roughly 141,000 students in Missouri with disabilities, making up just over 14% of the state's public school enrollment. The special education services encumbered in the $542 million include special education services, K-12, early childhood, and excess cost reimbursements. This equates to roughly $3,844 in total state spending per SPED student. That means that Missouri is heavily dependent on federal IDEA dollars and local revenue, unlike many of the states that invest more of their own state level budgets. This makes Missouri a bit of an outlier nationally, especially in terms of predictable state-funded support for special education. Missouri also uses a weighted student funding formula as the primary method to fund special education. But there's a significant caveat here. Districts don't receive additional funding for all students with disabilities. They only receive funding for those above the 13.3% threshold of total enrollment. Once a district passes that threshold, each additional student with disability generates 75% of a full attendance weight, which increases funding. But this means that districts with lower percentages of students receiving special education services, in fact, it's about half of them statewide, get no additional funding at all, despite having mandated costs. An example I've included here today, if the district has 100 special education students identified, they will receive 175% of state funding for only 86.7 of those students. To help districts that face particularly high special education costs, Missouri also offers a high need fund. If the cost of serving a student with disabilities is more than 3 times the district's average per pupil cost, the district can apply for reimbursement from this fund. It's an extra step in the process. In fiscal year 24, Missouri distributed nearly $60 million to 54 districts through this mechanism. While it's helpful for high cost cases, this approach does not fix the broader gaps in the formula, and the fund is always subject to legislation appropriations. So there's no guarantee that the same level of support will be available each year. With that, I'll turn it over to Eric to walk you through the nuances in Kansas.
Great. So as we'll see, Kansas is somewhat similar to Missouri in that it provides one mechanism with a high cost services reimbursement, but overall the approach is very different. So just some fast facts for you, similar to Missouri. Kansas has roughly 73,000 students receiving special education students currently, which is about 15% of the total public school enrollment. The total spent on special education as of fiscal year 24 was about $1.17 billion, making, and as you can see in the chart, the funds sources are mixed, but the plate stays a significant role. State aid covers about 45% of the total expenditures, or about $528 million. Kansas also receives $119 million from federal IDEA funds, about 10% of the total funding, and another $49 million from Medicaid reimbursements. That leaves about $470 million, or 40%, to be covered by local funds. So to dig into the model itself, Kansas primarily provides funding through a reimbursement-based approach to special education funding. This model is separate from the state's primary school funding formula. It doesn't rely on a base amount of funding per pupil or student weights, for instance. Instead, the state reimburses districts for what they define as excess special education costs. These are costs above and beyond what a district would typically spend to generally educate a general education student. The policy goal for the state of Kansas is to cover 92% of excess costs. But in the last few years, the reality has been quite different. State reimbursements have ranged between 74 to 80%, depending on legislative appropriations. This shortfall, I think, creates real consequences that we see districts are left to make up the difference using both local revenues and also general education funds, which adds to the unpredictability to district budgets and increases the financial burden at the local level. So I want to break down just how this reimbursement system actually works and also show you the other way that Kansas provides funds. First, in the reimbursement model, the state calculates the excess costs by subtracting general education funding that the district receives and all federal and Medicaid contributions from a district's total special education expenditures. Then, as per state law, the state would reimburse 92% of that end amount. But as I noted earlier, this is prorated because of underfunding. Separate from this is catastrophic aid, which is a categorical reimbursement program for students with very high cost needs. If a district has a student with services that cost more than $36,000 per year, they can apply for this catastrophic aid, which may cover up to 75% of costs beyond the threshold. But again, it's subject to the availability of funds from the legislature. So while this program helps districts with extreme individual cases, it doesn't necessarily address the broader funding gaps we're seeing in general special education expenditures across the state. So looking at a high-level overview of each state shows us what both must account for when designing and implementing these policies we've described to you today. You can see that Missouri has more students and special education students overall than Kansas, but is roughly equal in terms of state funding. This necessarily means that Missouri provides much less funding per student than Kansas. Can we go back one more slide, Tori? Thank you. Yeah, and here's a quick side-by-side summary of how Kansas and Missouri approach special education funding in terms of their policies. Like we described, Missouri uses a weighted funding model where the additional funding is based on attendance counts and only above a 13.3% threshold. That means many districts receive no additional funding for a portion of their students with disabilities. Kansas, in contrast, as I just described, uses a reimbursement model. Districts report excess costs, and the state reimburses a portion of those expenses. There is no threshold in Kansas, and the model is intended to provide more direct support based on actual expenditures. Both states offer some form of a high need reimbursement. Missouri reimburses districts with students who have costs more than 3 times the average amount per pupil, and Kansas provides categorical aid to those with excess costs exceeding $36,000 per student. But I think here's the key point. Neither state differentiates funding based on the intensity of student need or the type of services required to provide special education. A student receiving, for instance, 30 minutes of speech therapy per week is funded roughly about the same as one receiving full day behavioral supports. So that brings us, I think, to a broader question. What if funding were more directly tied to actual needs of students? So I want us to consider this hypothetical if we made special education funded more tied closely to the level of support based on student needs. So this hypothetical example you see on your screen is an example of a tiered model of support. Under this kind of system, students could be grouped into tiers based on service intensity or the type of disability they have. A student with mild needs might, for instance, generate 50% more funding, while a student with severe needs could generate up to 150% more. And this isn't just a thought exercise. Other states, like I'm about to show you, use multi-tiered funding systems with student weights linked to disability categories or service intensity. It also offers additional high-cost reimbursements for students should the state choose to keep those systems in place. The idea overall of these systems is to better align resources with actual costs of services. On this slide here are 2 state examples to demonstrate how states may differentiate funding to provide for student need according to disability type in both instances. As we see here, Texas offers a minor amount of funding for special education students who are deemed to receive, quote, mainstream, or they spend the majority of their time in general education settings, all the way up to 400% more for funding of homebound special education students. Ohio likewise provides a relatively low amount of funding for certain disabilities like speech and language impairments, all the way up to 400% more for very intense cases. Say we were interested in providing funds based on intensity of services. One proxy measure we could use is to see how long a special education student spends in certain settings and base the amount of support they need to reflect their time. For instance, Kansas has relatively available data, and we can see here the actual amount of time special education students spend in a regular class setting. This data from KSDE shows that 53,000 students with disabilities spend about 80% more of their day in general education classroom. These are students who may need only a mild amount of supports. Another 13,000 students are in general education classrooms between 40 and 79% of their time, likely needing more consistent or targeted supporting. And nearly 4,600 students spend a lot less than 40% of their day in general education settings, indicating they may need more intensive service needs. A model could look like this to assign tiers to better align funding with the level of support required. Again, this is not a proposal, but a way to reimagine how funds could follow student need rather than retrospective cost reimbursement, for instance. Another approach to tiered funding is by grouping students based on primarily their disability category. In Kansas, the largest group by far is students with learning disabilities. The same is true in Missouri, followed by those receiving speech and language services, autism, or other health impairments in both states. These disability categories could form the foundation for differentiated funding or weights assigned to disability categories, allowing a funding system to reflect the actual variation in service intensity and staffing needs to provide services to these types of disabilities. Again, this is just exploratory, but reflects a trend we're seeing in other states like Texas and Ohio, and also recently Tennessee, that are working to better match funding to the actual needs based on students. To wrap things up, we wanted to leave you some big picture things to consider when thinking about special education funding and the decisions states make when they're designing these policies. One is that support should follow student needs. Funding models should be flexible enough to reflect the level and type of services a student requires, not just system-wide averages. We should be planning for student needs, not just reacting to them. Reimbursement models, for instance, often respond after the fact. States should explore ways that help districts forecast and budget for services in advance. The demand for special education is growing. Enrollment in special education programs continues to grow, which places more pressure on district budgets and staffing capacity. And from what we know about all education, but especially special education, early identification leads to better outcomes. Timely diagnosis allows for earlier interventions, which are much more cost effective and efficient in the long run. And that is all we have for you today. At this point, I think we can transition over to a Q&A portion if we're ready for that, Tori. But I thank you all for your time and appreciate you for showing up.